So I want to tell you a story today about Anthony Ray Hinton. Some of you may know the name, but in July of 1985, Anthony was 29 years old. And on July 31st in Alabama, a town outside of Birmingham, he was at his mother's house where he lived, and he was mowing the lawn. If you can imagine, July 31st in Alabama, it was pretty hot. And he really didn't want to be out there mowing the lawn. He was sweaty. He had told his mother that he'd rather not. He'd just washed his car. He'd rather be inside. But he knew that he always did what his mother asked, right? So he was outside July 31st, 1985, mowing the lawn when a police car came up. And a couple of officers came up out of the car. They stood on the porch of his mother's house, and they called Anthony to them. And they said, "Anthony, you're under arrest." Anthony was flabbergasted. Why would he be under arrest? And they said, "Well, you're under arrest for murder of 2 restaurant workers and shooting a 3rd. Anthony had no idea what they were talking about. But he knew he had no choice but to go with them. And yet, in his mind, he knew, well, of course, people will realize that this is a terrible mistake. This is 1985, remember? I was in college at the time. It's not 1955 or 1965 in the midst of the Civil Rights era, but it's when persons of my color, of white privilege, understand that we thought we had been through those times. It's 1985. And Anthony is in the police car going to the jail, and he says, I really am innocent. And the officer turns to him and says, "Well, I don't know if you're innocent or not." He says, "You may be, but let me tell you 5 things. 1, you're black. 2, a white man says that you shot him. 3, you will have a white district attorney. 4, you will have a white judge. And 5, you will have an all-white jury." And so the officer continued. And so do you know what that means? Conviction, 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 conviction. Anthony was devastated. He still couldn't believe that this would be possible. He was assigned an attorney. And so the attorney that came to work with him, the first thing he said to him was, Anthony told him, "Well, I'm innocent." And his own defense attorney turned to him and said, "Well, you black guys always say you're innocent." This is his defense attorney. And so his defense attorney wrongly thought he only had $1,000 with which to try the case. And so he couldn't afford a real ballistics expert. The only piece of evidence that the prosecuting attorney brought against Anthony was that the bullets found at the restaurant matched the bullets of a gun in his mother's house. That's what they said. And so Anthony's attorney had this ballistics person who actually was gotten on the cheap. He was a civil engineer who had read some about ballistics. And he had a vision impairment, so he had a hard time seeing through the microscope. And so he didn't really even know how to turn it on. And so easily, his evidence was discounted. Now, Anthony also had an alibi that never made it into court. He was working at the time that the murders had happened. There was evidence that he had clocked in, that he worked at a warehouse that was locked, that his bosses and other people had seen him at work during the time of the murder that was supposed to have happened, and yet that was never brought to court. Anthony was placed on death row. He was convicted. And for 30 years, he sat on death row. Now, eventually, he did get some legal assistance. From the Equal Justice Initiative, they came, and they hired ballistics experts who were real ballistic experts, and they showed that the bullets did not match the bullets in the gun that was at his mother's house. It went to the Supreme Court, and his conviction was overturned. And in 2015, Anthony was a free man. 30 years on death row. 30 years in solitary confinement, which he described as 5-by-7 cell, about the size of your bathroom. Now, you may wonder what happens to a man after they've been wrongly incarcerated on death row for 30 years. And what's amazing about this story is that Anthony talked about forgiveness. He talked about God. And he said that through this experience, his faith in God grew stronger. On the steps as he was released, there were reporters around, and they were asking him questions about his incarceration, his wrong incarceration. And this is what he said. He said, my mother always taught me that God can do everything but fail. God can do everything but fail. So he knew that somehow he would get through this. The other thing that he said is, this is what I understood when I was in prison, is that God sits high and looks low. God sits high above all this. God has a perspective that we don't see. That in his 5-by-7 cell, he could not see beyond, but knew that God was watching. God sits high, but also looks low. Well, today we move to a series about the book of Ephesians. The book of Ephesians is really a letter. Now, it says in Ephesians it's a letter written by Paul, but really it's not. It was written about a generation after Paul had died by his followers. And this is a letter to a church or many churches in Asia Minor at the time that Paul had set up. And in the first 3 chapters, we just heard a section from the last part of the 3rd chapter. But the first 3 chapters of this letter to Ephesians are all about God, who God is, the glory of God. And in the section that we heard, it's written from the perspective of Paul as being in prison. And from his vantage point of being in a cell, being confined, we overhear his prayer to God for us, his church. His prayer for us is that we may come to understand the height, the breadth, the depth, and the length of God. That it takes someone in prison to truly understand the vastness of God. It takes someone in confinement to truly understand how freeing, how God is above all and over all. Paul understood that. And so his prayer for us as the church is that we too may understand the height, the depth, the breadth, and the length of God. Others who have been in prison, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Nelson Mandela, often have had similar revelations of God. That a prison cell cannot confine God. That God is far beyond that. And what is unfortunate is that sometimes we self-confine. We place ourselves in boxes. We think that we can measure how big God is, when God is far beyond what we can imagine, as Ephesians says. So God is higher than we can imagine. God looks down from a perspective that is far beyond our own. God has length beyond we can imagine. We live in the present time, in the midst of our current struggles, but God sees ahead of us. God sees the length of time ahead of us, as well as the length of time behind us. God has length. God has breadth. God's arms open far wider than we can imagine. Last night, I was invited to a grand opening of a business in Manassas. And the business was formed by one of our Muslim neighbor friends, Mehmet Ayaz, and he and his family have started this tile and floor business. And so he invited all those on his Facebook list to come and see the grand opening, where there was Syrian and Turkish food, and there was music. Now, I've known him a couple years now, since we've been engaged in conversation with our congregation and the congregation of his mosque. And I have to say, my understanding of Islam and those who are Muslim was confined to a box. I knew very little. I thought I knew more, but I knew very little. And one of the things that he shared last night is this piece of music. And I have to confess that before 2 years ago, if I had to think of what Muslim music might sound like, it was very different from what I heard last night. They played a piece on what looks like a large lyre, some kind of harp that was played on a lap. And it was a piece called "Love is an Everlasting Ocean." I don't think I would have said that that was a Muslim song before a couple of years ago. I would never have guessed that there would be such emotion and care and compassion in the music that those Syrian and Turkish refugees were singing last night. God is far broader than we can imagine. We may think that God is confined to our nation, our people, our denomination, but God's arms open wide. God is far broader. God is longer. God is taller. God has height, depth, and length. God is deep. I think when we recognize that most is when we are going through difficult times, when we're wondering why something has happened. Then we trust that somehow God goes deeper than we can imagine. That there is God in the presence of our most deep sufferings, and that God stays with us. God has depths. So today, as you think of the dimensions of God, think about Anthony Hinton and God's height. Think about time and God's length in front of us and behind us. Think of God's breath and the music of a Muslim, of a mosque, singing of love. And thinking of depth, times within ourselves that God is with us in the deeps. We give thanks for this God who cannot be measured. Amen. I invite you to stand. We're singing number 2 in the purple book. It's in the bulletin, but it's missing a line. So open your purple book and we'll sing number 2.